Good morning. This is 7th grade social studies. I'm Dina Vandenbosch. Let's learn some geography. This is our last week together. We're going to be looking at our standard of 10.1, which is looking at different types and characteristics of natural hazards. So the region that we're going to be looking at this week is an area that knows a lot about natural hazards. So we'll talk about that. But first, we'll do it one last time, our Where in the World segment. This one's a little bit harder, so I wouldn't blame you if you're not quite sure of the name, but let's see what we can do. So let's try to guess it in as few clues as possible. Clue number one, it's in Southeast Asia. So that should give you a hint as to where we'll be today. Clue number two, it was built in the 12th century, so around 1100. Clue number three, it's the largest religious monument in the world. And then clue number four, it is featured on Cambodia's flag. And let me show you what that looks like. So this is Cambodia's flag, and that is the structure. Do you recognize it but can't remember the name? Okay, it's Angkor Wat. This is a temple complex in Cambodia. It was originally built as a Hindu temple. It was converted to a Buddhist temple. It was built by the Khmer, which was a civilization in that region, and it has really become a big tourist hotspot. It's even been recognized by the United Nations. So here's another view of it. So if you're ever in Cambodia, I hope you get a chance to visit this. Today's objective, we're going to be looking at Southeast Asia, and we want to answer the question, how do the people of Southeast Asia impact or interact with the physical geography and the natural hazards that occur there? So let's go all the way over from our part of the world to Southeast Asia. So from Washington, D.C. to the capital of the Philippines, which is Manila, it's about 8,500 miles. So let's look at our political map first. We always want to start with where things are. So let's look at the countries that are part of this region. Now this is the region between Australia and China mainland. It's just to the east of India. So the first one that we have, and actually I should say that Southeast Asia is unique. It's got some mainland countries and island countries. So we want to start first with the mainland, and there in the green is Myanmar, also formerly known as Burma. We have Thailand with its capital of Bangkok. We have Laos in the purple. Cambodia, the smaller one, the yellow one, there on the coast. And then Vietnam has a long coastline. Its capital is in the north, Hanoi. And then in the south, it's got the major city of Ho Chi Minh City, used to be called Saigon. And then we have Malaysia. Look down in the pink. At the very end of that peninsula, Malaysia has part of it on the mainland, and then part of it is actually on another island. We'll talk about that. So the islands that we have, in addition to Malaysia being on both mainland and island, is Indonesia. Look at the country in green. Look at that huge country made up of thousands of islands. So this is a good example of an archipelago. We have the Philippines with its capital of Manila, also an archipelago. We have the small country of Brunei, and I used an arrow so that you could see it. You'd almost miss it. It's right there, borders Malaysia. It's on the island of Borneo. We also have a small nation named Singapore. Singapore is a huge shipping port. It used to be part of Malaysia. Now it's an independent country. And then the small country, tiny country of East Timor. All right, so those are our countries of Southeast Asia. Let's look at a physical map of this region. All right, so let's start with latitude. One thing that we do need to point out is where this is on Earth. This is at the equator. We've got the equator, which is our 0 degrees line of latitude, and then we've also got the Tropic of Cancer, which is 23.5 degrees north latitude. So knowing that this region falls within that tropical region, you can imagine that that impacts the climate here. The bodies of water that are significant here, there are many. We'll just name a few. The Pacific Ocean to the east and the Indian Ocean to the west. We also have the South China Sea. Now, you'll always hear things that happen in the South China Sea because look how many countries border it. China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, just to name a few. And there's a lot of conflict about who owns which islands in the South China Sea, who has rights to drilling, for oil and natural gas, who has rights to the fisheries. So stay tuned, you'll hear about it in the news. There's the Strait of Malacca. This has historically been a very strategic waterway. All the shipping that comes from India, from the Indian Ocean to China, goes through that port. So this is the busiest strait on Earth. We've got the Mekong River, which is the longest river here in Southeast Asia. It flows through Vietnam. We also have the Chao Phraya River, which has its, it goes through numerous countries here, but has its delta in the Bangkok region. And then the last river here is the Irrawaddy River in Myanmar. So let's take a look at a couple of major landforms. I mentioned earlier that we've got that long peninsula. That's called the Malay Peninsula. It's got the countries of Myanmar, Thailand, and Malaysia on it. And it is a long but narrow peninsula. It's mainly made up of rainforest. Obviously, we've got the archipelagos that we mentioned before. And then there are major islands, and this can get a little confusing. Some of the islands have multiple countries on them. So let's look, for example, Borneo. Borneo is the island, but not a country. So the island of Borneo has the countries of Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia on it. Another country, Sumatra, which is in Indonesia, the island of Java. And Java, I should say, is where most of the people of Indonesia live. That's where its capital is as well. The island of Bali, Sulawesi, and then the island of New Guinea. All right, so those are the major islands of Southeast Asia. Now, normally, if you're paying attention, I have a question at this time about New Guinea. What was going on there? So let's look at it in closer detail. Notice that New Guinea is an island, but part of it is shaded green to signify that it is part of Indonesia. So what's going on with this eastern half? Well, the simple answer is half the island is part of Indonesia, and half of it is its own separate country called Papua New Guinea. Why that is not considered part of Southeast Asia? You got me, but it's considered part of the Australia region. So there you go. You'll have to do some research to find out why. All right, so let's take a look at a population density map. You can see, according to this view, the red is where you have the highest concentrations of people. And if you notice, we're going to see this right around some river deltas where the river meets the sea. We've got one around Hanoi. We've got one near Ho Chi Minh City. We've got one near Bangkok. And then you can really see the red show up down here on the island of Java, which is the most populated spot for Indonesia. We're going to just zoom in just on the mainland countries of Southeast Asia and notice where the red dots here are. Now, don't get confused. The red dots here, they don't look as prevalent, right? It doesn't look as red. Well, they're using a different scale. So for this one dot represents 100,000 people. On the last map that I showed you, it may have been 50,000. So this one is not going to seem as red, but you can really kind of correlate the locations of the human settlements with the locations of rivers, and that is not a coincidence. You tend to see them around the coastlines as well as the river deltas. Here's Ho Chi Minh City, here's Hanoi, here's Bangkok, and that's where you tend to have most people live. Being around water is obviously good for lots of things: irrigation of your crops, transportation, water for drinking. All right, so let's do Southeast Asia by the numbers. Here's a list of our countries along with land area and population. So my first question to you is, which country is the smallest? So let's look in the second column and try to find the smallest one. And if you look down there at the bottom, Singapore, okay, only 265 square miles. Okay, that's pretty small, but let's compare that to the larger countries. Question number two, which has the most people? Let's find in the third column, the country that has the highest. And we're not going to look at the one that's really the highest, which is the United States, because it's not part of this region. But there it is, Indonesia, with 242 million people. And it's also the largest. So just see the vast differences in size that we have here. Indonesia is actually so large and so spread out that it takes up 1/8 of the circumference of the Earth. All right, so we've answered question number 3. Let's look at this. How does Indonesia compare to the United States? Well, let's find the United States down there. In terms of population, they're not that far off, okay? And again, these numbers are a little dated, but Indonesia has about 242 million. According to this, the United States had 307 million at the time of this publication. So they're not that far off, but look at the size difference. Indonesia, with 699,000 square miles, is about 1/7 the size or 1/5 the size of the United States. So much more densely populated. And then finally, which has a higher population density, Laos or Singapore? All right, so let's find Laos and let's find Singapore. All right, in terms of land area, you can see that Laos is much larger than Singapore, okay, 89,000 compared to 265 miles. Look at their population. So Laos has over 6 million people, Singapore 4.7 million. So what does that tell you about which one's more densely populated? Okay, Singapore's a tiny island or tiny nation, but its population is right up there with Laos, so it's going to be the one that's more densely populated for sure. All right, so moving on, some quick facts about Southeast Asia. So we've already said that this is a region that consists of mainland countries and island countries. All of these mainland countries have a coastline except for Laos, which is the one landlocked country here. This area was formerly known by other names. Okay, the mainland countries were known as Indochina. The island countries went by the name of the East Indies. They were also known as the Spice Islands. This is where Europeans would get nutmeg and cinnamon and cloves, things that were rare and were valuable. And so there was a huge trade between this region and European nations. Indonesia is the 4th most populated country in the world. Most of its people live on the island of Java. We've already mentioned where we are latitude-wise, so this gives it a tropical climate, and it has one of the highest biodiversity rates in the world, so some plants and animal species that are really unique. The religious diversity is worth noting. Indonesia is the most populated country in the world with a Muslim majority. Okay, so Islam is the predominant religion in Malaysia and Indonesia. However, Buddhism is also prevalent in this area. It came from India, so it's prevalent in the mainland nations here. And also Christianity. Christianity came when Spain colonized the Philippines. So this is a real interesting mix of religions, as well as other ethnic groups and cultures and languages. There are over 700 languages spoken in Indonesia. So it's a variety of cultures, a variety of influences. It's a spread out area, especially with your archipelago nations. So this is a really unique place and part of the world. So let's make a prediction. Looking at the physical map of Southeast Asia, and based on the location, what do you think some of the natural hazards would be that they face throughout the year? All right, let's see if you are right. Okay, so knowing where they are and knowing what we talked about last week, you could probably know that they are in the same position that Japan and the Koreas and China were in. Their location along the Ring of Fire make earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and the threat of tsunamis part of daily life, okay, due to its location. They also have to deal with flooding, mudslides, landslides, and these can be triggered by heavy monsoon rains that they also get. It can be due to deforestation that is taking place, as well as some of the agricultural methods like slash and burn farming. And then finally, tropical storms impact this region. Cyclones that happen in the Indian Ocean, typhoons is what they're called in the Pacific Ocean. These happen between the months of May and November. In fact, right now, the coast of India and Bangladesh and possibly Myanmar are dealing with a very strong typhoon or cyclone that's coming ashore, which is a double whammy for them because it's a very densely populated area and they're dealing with the COVID crisis. So we think about those people. All right, so let's look at Indonesia. Indonesia is very unique. It consists of 17,000 islands. Again, many of them are not inhabited. But this is at the intersection of some tectonic plates. So you can imagine that there's a heightened risk of seismic activity and volcanic activity. In fact, Indonesia, of all countries in the world, has the most active volcanoes in the world. So let's take a look at why. This is a map showing the location of tectonic plates and volcanic activity. So the red lines represent the borders of the tectonic plates, and you can see that we have several here. We've got the Eurasian plate, which is showing the mainland of Southeast Asia and almost all of the countries. We've got the Philippine plate that runs along the edge of the Philippines. To the south, we've got the Australian plate, and then we've got the Pacific plate right above New Guinea. So at the intersection of all of these plates, and they're colliding and putting pressure on one another, then you can imagine that we've got some seismic activity. And then the small red triangles represent volcanic eruptions. So there is a direct correlation along the edges here. And that's what we saw last week when we looked at the location of significant volcanic eruptions and earthquakes in the Ring of Fire. Okay, so we've just zoomed in, and we're really in an area that has active both of these. Unfortunately, earthquakes can often trigger tsunamis, and this region has seen its share. One of the most devastating tsunamis in history was in December 2004. This impacted the island of Sumatra on Indonesia, and its power alone killed over 230,000 people. That's 250,000 people who died from one seismic event. So this wave impacted life there and devastated it. This is a picture of before and after in some parts of Sumatra. So why on earth would someone want to live in an area like this? Here's a view of a volcano that's active in Indonesia. Does it have its disadvantages? For sure. Might there be advantages to living near a volcano? That might not be something you're used to thinking about, so let's look at that. This is Mount Sinabung in Sumatra, Indonesia. It was dormant for about 400 years, and then it erupted in 2010, forcing thousands to flee their homes. But notice how closely people live to the volcano, so there must be a reason. And that reason is simply that this is the richest soil in the world. The nutrient-rich soil that comes from ash from the volcanoes makes farming there really productive, and they have a good climate for year-round production. So it's kind of a balancing act between the disadvantages of living so close to something and the advantages of doing so. People of Southeast Asia take advantage of their environment through necessity as well. They have really adapted to what the land has given them. This is a fishing village in Vietnam. One thing you'll see in this area of the world is a focus on subsistence fishing. Okay, we've talked about subsistence farming before. So you can imagine what this means. Kind of the same thing, just dealing with fishing. This is where you're fishing to feed one's own family. Okay, you're not in business of fishing. What you're catching is to feed your family. It's the opposite of commercial fishing for profit. It's also not the same as recreational fishing that we might do. But many rely on the rivers and the seas of this region for their livelihood. Here's a view of the Malay Peninsula. I mentioned to you that it has a lot of rainforest, mountains with lush forest, rich biodiversity in this region. They are starting to do more of the ecotourism to try to conserve their natural environment. But yet you see the contrast with what we see here on the island of Borneo. A lot of slash and burn farming, unfortunately. Many times they're cutting down what trees there are there to then plant trees that are more profitable, rubber trees and palm oil trees. So this is a real concern in this region. And then when you have this, obviously when it does rain, you've got the mudslides and landslides. One visual vocabulary word I wanted to show you was terrace forming. I think this is a really neat concept. It was done out of necessity. But this is a method of farming that's done on hills and mountains, and there's a lot in this region, so they tend to do that. They cut flat steps into the hillside, and that basically prevents the crops from, the soil from eroding, but it's really well suited for rice growing that is done in this region, okay? The rice terraces in the Philippines are world famous. They were built by hand. Some date them as maybe as old as 2,000 years, but certainly over 1,000 years old. But it's a beautiful thing to see there. You can see here's another view in Bali, Indonesia. But again, the rich soil because of the volcanic ash. So our essential question today was looking at physical geography and natural hazards and how they impact life in Southeast Asia. So we've talked about that. Numerous hazards here, from earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, monsoons, and typhoons. They can obviously disrupt life, okay? Lead to destruction of property and crops, lead to loss of life, lead to mass evacuations. We also, in this region, are seeing some early warning systems, land management, and conservation efforts. But people have adapted to conditions in a number of ways, such as terrace farming, rice cultivation, fishing and maritime activities, such as building homes to allow for changing tides and boat traffic. So people have adapted to what the physical geography has given them. And also the humid and tropical climate here supports a long growing season. So most of the farming is done in the river deltas or in those rich soils of volcanic areas. So a couple of review questions. Let's see if you were listening. What are the two main parts of Southeast Asia? Mainlands and islands, peninsula and isthmus, small and large archipelagos, tectonic plates, or Indonesia and Thailand. Okay, and I've mentioned this several times. So the two main parts are the mainland countries and our island countries. Another question, Laos is the only landlocked country in Southeast Asia. This is characterized by all of the following except which statement? So all of these will be true except one. Which is it? Does landlocked mean it is entirely surrounded by land, that it has no coastline, that there are no rivers running through it, that it is entirely inland, or that it has no seaports? Okay? And the best answer is that it has no rivers running through it. You can still be a landlocked country and still have rivers, but the other things are true about being a landlocked country. And then finally, why have sections of the rainforest in Malaysia and Thailand been cut down? And I mentioned this toward the end. Is it to clear space for new urban areas, to make transportation easier throughout the countries, to create space for livestock to graze, to make room for large farms of certain trees, or to improve the ecotourism industry? And the correct answer is to make room for those trees that are more profitable. Well, Mobile County has been advertising a chance to win prizes if you've been watching. And so I'll leave you with this. If you're interested in perhaps the chance to win Chick-fil-A or a t-shirt, then answer this question. What region did we learn about today? I gave you a softball question, so let's see if you can answer it. Email your answer to mcpsstv@mcpss.com. All right, so that's your question. And make sure that you indicate that it's for 7th grade geography. Well, that is all the time we have. This is our final week. We have barely scratched the surface of all the things that you could learn about in geography. So I hope that your interest has been piqued so that you can be motivated to learn more about your world. There are a lot of resources out there. One that I would suggest is the Alabama Virtual Library. If you can visit that, there are some great resources there through the Encyclopedia Britannica. I encourage you to do some reading on your own, listen to the news, find out what's going on in your world, and we'll see you back next year. Thank you.